Thank you, everyone. I would like to welcome, first and foremost, the panelists to the stage. So could I please welcome Philip Cattell? So Philip is a board member of FIRMA, the Federation of Risk Management Association. He also coordinates the program for cyber insurance at Airbus, and he's had extensive experience in innovation, winning an award for his insurance innovation program in 2018. Next, I would like to introduce Steve Purser. Steve comes from a software program and development background. He had a former role as a CISO and currently is the head of core operations at ANISA. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Pavel Surovska, president of the board of PZU. He comes from a banking and investment background, formerly Bank of America Merrill Lynch in Paris, portfolio management, risk management, and also having extensive involvement within the insurance sector, running or the CEO of PZU at the moment. Before we start today's discussion, I wanted to just introduce a little bit of context. So our previous speaker spoke today about the journey. When we think about cyber insurance and cyber insurability, that is part of a journey. But we often think of the individual components that make up that journey. But instead, here who we've got on the panel today, we've got representatives from large corporate buyers, we've got representatives that deal with the regulatory side, and we've got the industry side. So instead of thinking about each piece along the journey, we need to also start to think about how do all of those pieces fit together? How do we think about cyber, insurability, responsibility, regulation, and the interaction of the business world and the security world holistically? And to that, I'll open the panel with a question. So currently there's an increase in cyber insurance being offered. Do you think that, and this is to the panel in general, do you think that the industry should continue to offer as much cyber insurance? If so, are there certain things that should be put into place? More regulation, less regulation? Should there be more onus on the buyer to understand their own risks? So I'd like to start with Philip.
Hi everybody. I am an engineer, so I'm very poor at talking. And usually the problem with engineers is that they start from A to Z, and by F or G, it's really boring, and nobody listens anymore. So I go to the end. The end is cyber insurance as such is only the last stage of the rocket. As a space engineer, I have to say it that way. So if you really want the satellite to be launched properly well, you need to build a full rocket, not just last stage. And that's why, I mean, yes, cyber insurance development is important because we need that as part of the rocket. But you need the booster. You need to really be able to understand your risk, understand how you mitigate those risks, and understand the value that you will find on the cyber insurance that you will buy. So that is really part of a global system. Because there is no point of just buying a cyber insurance cover just because your management says, well, are we insured for cyber? It makes no sense because it doesn't really answer. You don't have a standard for cyber insurance. So just answering yes, we are insured doesn't really mean anything and doesn't really protect anything, and it also undervalue what is the potential of cyber insurance itself. So really, if you really want to have the most of the benefit of that tool, you need to be able to be aware of what you're going to buy and to be able to value what you will get as a transfer of that. So make sure that what you are transferring into the cyber insurance policy is corresponding to what you need and is corresponding to your understanding of your exposure, so that it's really a mutual effort that you do with you and the insurers.
Excellent. I might move now to Pavel. from the industry perspective?
Well, as a CEO, I'm supposed to be good at talking, but it will be difficult to be better than that. So I totally subscribe to what Philippe just said. I mean, obviously, when the question is, am I interested in our market is getting bigger? Obviously, we are. You know, this is a still very growing, thriving way for insurers to, you know, reap the benefits of technological, of the way that, you know, our behavior, consumer behavior changes, to, you know, a growth area which maybe will compensate some of the areas that will disappear with changing customer behavior, like NTP or motor insurance, being given that we all are going to go through self-driving cars. So maybe in order to, you know, insure the drivers, we will concentrate on ensuring the operators of the self-driving platforms, including against cyber risks. So obviously, this is a way how the insurance business can think about the future. But it is absolutely true that there's no point in pushing insurance policies when they're not enshrined in the right framework and also in the right awareness of the companies of the risks that they're facing. Because if, you know, insurance companies continue to write insurance policies and corporates continue buying them without really a right understanding of how to use them and what exactly the covers is aimed at, then it necessarily will lead at some point or the other to frustration. And what is important is that companies, first and foremost, understand the risks that they're facing, understand which of the risks they are willing to take, which of the risks they are not willing to take and have to take active steps of taking them out, and which of the risks they want to insure against. And obviously, to go one path beyond is that to a certain extent, it is already the case, but it's going to be the case even more so in the future, I believe, that cyber insurance will really be a dialogue and really be a cooperation between the insuring entity and the company, where at some point the burden needs to be taken together, in the sense that obviously companies like Airbus have a fantastic way of understanding the risk and they have all the right tools in place. But this is not the case of every player in the corporate market. So I think the insurance companies will be also the ones who will need to really popularize the right element of cyber resilience to, you know, large layers of the corporate landscape, and, you know, then ensure against what is left of the risk that can be taken out of it by technical means. So again, yes, I'm obviously in favor of ensuring more against cyber, but this really needs to be part of a holistic framework that includes corporations, the right technical partners, and obviously governments, and then insurers also at the table.
Excellent. So Steve, we've heard from...
And regulate.
We've heard from the
Not to
viewpoint of the buyer. We've heard from, obviously, who wants to understand more, make sure that there's, I guess, sufficient corporate understanding. We've heard from the insurer as well, that sort of, again, echoed that need for greater corporate understanding from, I guess, the regulatory and also that more holistic viewpoint. What's your viewpoint? Do you think we should be growing the market? Do you think we should be focused more on sustainable growth, or refining what we currently have? Education, regulation, what's your viewpoint?
Well, I think we should be understanding more. Look, let me take a step back and look at the big picture. Take what I will call the economics of security, of which insurance is one mechanism. We don't really have a very good understanding of economics of security worldwide. It's a very underdeveloped area. So if you look not only at Europe, but you look globally, there are no consistent metrics. So people are not using the same things to measure spending, return on investment, etc. There are no regular and consistent reports, either on microeconomic or macroeconomic factors. And I would say there's a poor understanding of what the data actually means. Let me give you some examples of that. It's easy to fall into the trap that people say, we're seeing more and more incidents, therefore more and more incidents must be happening. That is almost certainly true, but the way the statement is made is not true, because part of the problem is we are measuring more. So what am I saying is you've got to be scientific about this. To see exactly how big the problem is and how much you quantify it, you need to have methods which are scientific and which are reasonable. And this is one of the biggest problems hitting the insurance industry, so I'm going to come back to it. Is this data even comparable? I'd say it's not to a certain extent. And is it predictive? There's not a lot of evidence that incident data is predictive. I've been following it for almost 25 years. And then you get things like black swan events, such as the, I can't remember it, the virus, that attacked the centrifuges. Well, I want to cry another example, but black swan events, Stuxnet, that's the one. Stuxnet is a superb example of how technically it was very easy to predict, but the sociological consequences were not. Suddenly we were not talking about financial risk, we were talking about death of people. That's a whole different scenario. So I think the economics of security is really important, and we need to understand it more. We need more studies. We need to know where we're spending, what we're getting back, what damage is occurring, and how to mitigate it. That would be my first point. I think also we have measures for security return on investment, but they're not widely employed and they're rather immature. This started in the late 1990s, but hasn't really developed to the extent that I would like to see it develop these days. And yet we know that economics is a huge driver of cybersecurity. Almost every decision you make as a CISO is economically driven. Now, my claim here is that cybersecurity is a huge driver of economics, in the sense that, think of things like Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, etc. It's a different ball game. I'm going to link it back to insurance in a minute. But I think it's really important to understand where these factors are going in order to answer your question. So I think there's a need to link what's happening in terms of technology development and societal development in order to understand how the insurance market will develop. We at TINISA did a study with McKinsey in 2015. We estimated, to give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem, that the opportunity cost of doing the wrong thing in cybersecurity between 2014 and 2020 is about 640 billion euros. So we're talking a lot of money. And one of the things is to the extent in which in a global environment insurance companies can take on these kind of risks. That we can come back to later. I also think that a lot of ideas that are underlying what are called current control frameworks originate from the 1980s and 1990s. They do not scale well. They do not cope well with fast time to market, which we're seeing, and strong cost drivers, which we're seeing in the market today. So in other words, we are using techniques which were developed for a totally different world. And I think these techniques have to be re-engineered. We need to rethink the opportunity cost balance, the opportunity risk balance, in order to be able to protect systems correctly in a new world. One way you might do that, all security is people, process, technology, is to put more emphasis on process, for instance, which is more scalable. I'm not saying you don't secure the objects, but certainly securing the processes may make a lot more sense. Now, let's bring it back to insurance. If what I'm saying is correct, and I'm just throwing it out for discussion, that we are in a transition phase to a new world, again, with very high scalability, 20 billion plus devices in 2020, short time to market, strong cost drivers, etc. How well can insurance companies really cover their risk? Even professional CISOs are struggling in this environment. So what do I think is the big solution? I think certainly we don't stop insurance. That would be crazy. We help the insurance companies develop their business as it goes along. It's a very important part of managing risk. But at the same time, I think ENISA, agencies like us, the Commission, etc., will aim to work on improving the fundamentals. And here, the Commission has just come out with a concept of European cybersecurity competence centers. This could be a great thing for them to study, giving the background and the true understanding of the problem that insurance companies will need in order to handle this risk in a correct way. And I think I have other things to say, but I think that basically says what I want to say. So more understanding is needed before I could really say is more insurance needed or not, from my perspective.
Thank you very much for that. So again, the theme tends to be on sort of understanding, but again, it's almost a, I guess, segmented approach. We've got our silos within companies, within the industry, wanting to work together, but the question then is, how can we work together? Where does responsibility lie? I mean, one thing that was previously mentioned by you, Steve, was the need for more research by both Pavel and Philip, was about the greater understanding, that sort of rich understanding. So I'll put this question out there, is it actually research we need? Is it data we need? Is it that we need to get together in a more structured manner with all of the different parties involved, as opposed to doing lots of pieces or lots of individual aspects of research, but look more holistically at the problem, either at a national or an international, or even perhaps a global level. So I'll start this time with Paul.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, there were so many aspects to that, it's really difficult to give one answer. I think it really, I think the approaches are very different. First of all, country by country, depending also, on the exposure and the resilience and the awareness of the different players. And then also by market segment, obviously, the large corporations have a different self-awareness and different aspects than small and medium enterprises, who are vulnerable as well and they pose a risk to the overall society by being open to breaches just as well. So obviously, to bring in maybe a little bit of a regional perspective, obviously what we find is incredibly important and what we struggle with is really make business leaders understand how important investment in cybersecurity is for their own business. And obviously, in a country where innovation and really an international property-based business market economy is just being built up, this awareness is gradually going up. And I think it is, the cybersecurity aspect and the need for investment is only about growing in countries like Poland. So first of all, I think that, the aspect that we are struggling with as an insurer is that people probably face more risk than they're actually aware of. And first of all, you need to, you need to educate them to a certain extent, which is why, by the way, we get engaged in conferences like CyberSec. The other aspect is that, and here I'm totally with you, it is absolutely necessary to also create the right frameworks to justify investment in those segments, because as a business leader, obviously you are afraid of data breaches, you are afraid of exposing your company to risks that might damage the reputation. But how do you justify the right amount of investments in a business level? And we ourselves even, are having interesting discussions over how do you really calculate the NPV of, investing into your own cybersecurity. And it goes really back to a more philosophical question: is how much is trust and stability and reliability and one of your products and an element of your business development, and then and only then does it play into the field of actually taking the decision of getting insured or not. So I think a lot of work is needed from the both, and not only government level, but I think on a regional level. I think the cybersecurity aspect is bigger than the means and resources of a lot of governments, and therefore I believe that, for example, was the right approach that what is now called the 3 Cs initiative, that, for example, Central Eastern European countries try to work together more into cybersecurity aspects. I think here, within obviously the framework of the European Union, there is space for more bundled approaches where countries can try to pool resources, work out frameworks, bring in corporate leaders like ourselves to the table to work out solutions that maybe will address some of the problems that you have just mentioned. And we as a company start to promote this kind of cooperation between countries. We are present not only in Poland but also in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and obviously for us it is in Ukraine. And obviously all of those countries are dealing with very different ways and cyber threats. And I think that within our company, making sure that we exchange experience and exchange best practices is already something that is extremely helpful.
Excellent. Thanks, Pavel. Steve?
Yeah. So now, having set the scene, perhaps let's go right into the mechanics of insurance. So, Anissa has done a few studies on this, and one of the biggest things that came out of these studies was there's definitely a problem with taxonomy and language. Different insurers explain different risks using different words. And that's a problem for the consumer in the sense that it's very hard to compare policies when you're using different terms to do this. So I think the first thing I would say is that there seems to be a need, based on our studies at least, for a common taxonomy. And this is not only limited to the insurance industry, this is actually quite a big theme. We're also doing it for CSIRTs, we're doing it for governments. So it seems to be a very big thing. And the good news is there's a lot of things that could be lent on here. I think this understanding of risk is really key. And to give an idea of just how complex it is, one of the things that hit us a few years ago is that people tend to associate safety and security, saying they're the same thing. They're actually not. I mean, think of the German Air Wings crash, where the pilot used a security feature to kill people. This was the door. So the assumption that security and safety go hand in hand is also not correct. I have no idea how this is going to hit insurers, but I feel it will do. What I'm saying is the notion of risk is changing, and I think one of the biggest challenges for insurers is understanding how it's changing, how to quantify it, because at the end of the day, you are putting monetary value on risk, and in some areas this is notoriously difficult to do, and how to make sure the data you're getting is sufficiently solid, robust, and predictive to serve your needs. So I would add this. So there's obviously a need to look at the way data is being collected and make sure it's coming in at the right level for you. I think more use could be made of information security and data privacy regulations, and also if we are to, I think developing industry standards and certification schemes will also help. It's not the magic bullet, it's not going to save everything, but the fact that someone has been certified in the future will tell you something, and that's something upon which you can build policies, I think. Other ideas that my people have given me for this particular part is obviously developing in-house experience. This is, of course, going to be difficult because there's a huge competition for cybersecurity skills. Globally, across Europe and across different branches of business. And last but not least, of course, and I'm sure this is being done, is to make sure that we cover all segments of the market, right up from SMEs to global players. Here, what worries me a little bit is that the notion of risk on the internet could be, huge. And I have no idea. I work for a company that had $10 trillion worth of assets. That's a lot of money if you want to insure, and we were actually insured by a consolidation of backing banks. So I don't know how this fits into the business. I'm not an insurance expert, but I think in a global internet environment, liabilities and risk could be huge.
Thanks, Steve. So, Philip, before I get on to you, I wanted to, as a sophisticated insurance buyer, the question then that's sort of posed by that is, from a buyer's perspective, and obviously Airbus has got a lot of resources, would it be beneficial to have greater standardization, to have sort of not necessarily uniform definitions, but core understandings that you can compare insurance products, product by product, wording by wording, or alternatively, as a large buyer, is it to your advantage that different insurers describe the risks and tailor risks individually? Obviously, your perspective is going to be different to an SME, but I wanted to get the perspective of a large buyer.
Well, I mean, you had very good speakers, and I'm sorry to be the worst of that, but I try to keep it. When I'm continuing about cyber risk, I mean, to some extent, I really want to make sure that cyber risk is a risk among others. And we address this risk with the same sort of techniques that we manage risks over the place and the company. And I'm sometimes a bit worried by too many research programs when you see the development of digitization within companies. It's taking place now, not in 5 years' time. So we have to address that risk among others now and to be credible now. That's why, I mean, when we started to consider that, to implement sort of risk management techniques to cyber risk, we thought at Fermat that it was probably good to introduce the cyber corporate governance approach in order to secure that, yes, it's a risk among others. We just need to make sure that the board members are aware of the consequence of their choice, because digitization is their choice. They decide to develop new services which are digitalized. They decide that they would go to digitalization internally to be more efficient. That's their decision. But so far, nobody told them about the consequence of that decision. So the purpose of that governance is to give them, okay, with the business and security together, this is the consequence for you, for the company, of that decision, with some scenarios of exposure, quantified scenarios of exposure, and that gives them really an appreciation of their risks. And then give them options, because as a top management, they need to be the driver of the strategy of the company. And on cyber, for sometimes, the strategy was developed by just the cyber experts. But in fact, as I mentioned, this is their decision. They decide to develop their business in a digital way. That creates some new opportunity and some new exposure. They have internal resources that are limited. Where do you put your resource internally to maximize the benefit for the company and to reduce the risk where it's most efficient? And for that, again, the governance is a way to give them, among others, what are the choice that they are able to drive in order to mitigate the exposure of the company. And then that's where the second part is about insurance. Because then, as the internal resources are limited, then you need to think about transfer, because that's an efficient way. We are talking about economic efficiency. Economic efficiency is to be able to identify your risk, put your resource where it makes more sense, and buy the insurance product which is effectively making more sense. And on that, we saw a number of so-called remarks that you see, like there is not enough capacity in the market, or the conditions are unclear, or that there is maybe uncertainty about the product. In reality, what do we see is the fact that for most of the buyers, they are driven by budget more than capacity. And in fact, they are not facing a lack of capacity. In fact, they are facing really the problem to convince internally their management to have the right budget to cover what they need to cover. So that's why we decided last year to issue a new document, which at Pharma we did with the European stakeholders. So Insurance Europe was there, because we really want to have all the parties involved. So Insurance Europe, BIPA, were there to help us to have one single document about preparing for cyber insurance. And what was the purpose of that? It was to address two kinds of frustrations that we see all over the place. One frustration is about underwriting information. On the buyer side, they are frustrated because they are bombarded with questionnaires that they have no clue about, and where they don't really see the purpose and they don't really understand the consequence. And on the insurer side, they are frustrated because, as a consequence, the answers to their questionnaires are quite poor. And as such, they are not able to appreciate the quality of the risk. And the second frustration was about the coverage itself. Frustration on the buyer side because they say, well, there's not the same wording. We don't really understand the coverage. Sometimes cyber insurance is embedded within the traditional coverage. Sometimes it's dedicated cyber policy. Sometimes it's service policy. We don't really understand anything about that, and we can't really judge what is really the best for us. And on the insurer side, they are frustrated because they consider that the product that they offer is actually really good and covers a lot of aspects that are really unprecedented in any other part of the coverage area. And the purpose of that document was effectively driving for SMEs, middle company, where they have a need for cyber insurance because they are fragile. And they are probably also quite a nice target for potential cyber attack and cyber issues. But they may not have all the expertise to buy, to convince what they have to buy, to put the process to buy properly what they need to buy. And really what we wanted through that document, and I'm going to close there, is to be able to free up this dialogue, to increase the quality of the dialogue between the insured and the insurers and the brokers inside, in order to make sure that there is a better understanding of what needs to be provided as information. No questionnaire, but clearly what are the key elements that are of information that are really important, that have a value for the insurers. And it's up to each insurer to have its own questionnaire, to fulfill its own questionnaire, based on its own underwriting policy. And then for the coverage, to identify the 4 pillars of coverages, so that for each company, they can really appreciate, among those different parameters, which of those are making most of sense for their own purpose, so that they are more comfortable to say, well, I want to buy this one because I'm convinced that it makes sense for me. Clear?
Yes. So I'll then throw out a different perspective. So we've, in essence, talked about sort of problems and challenges, etc. But then the one thing that we haven't necessarily focused on so much is about the solution, about the resilience aspect, about how we go about working out how to share information, how to coordinate, etc. The Geneva Association, for those of you that aren't aware, we're a representative body of the insurance industry. We represent the CEOs from the biggest global insurers and or reinsurers. In a recent report that we did on accumulation, cyber accumulation and cyber insurance, one of the things that we found is that for cyber to be insurable and to be sustainable, you needed to have resilience at the source. So in terms of that, we've heard common threads about sharing of information, sharing of data, etc. What I really would like to hear is in terms of actually sharing, because as we all know, there's a lot of reports that are produced from different agencies. How can we better coordinate all of the efforts in terms of practical applied research that will feed its way into underwriting in terms of the products that are offered, being able to reflect the different needs of the different insurer base as well, the different client base, and also reflecting the government and or regulatory scheme and the need for ensuring that there's enough, I guess, capital and or that products are being written in a sustainable and prudent fashion. So I would like, on that general wave, I'd like to hear your thoughts on would it be better for the industry to start sharing data, to start collaborating more, for customers to be encouraged more to work together with other corporates to collectively understand what similar customers would face in terms of their own exposures. How do we actually go about, again, on that journey, rather than thinking about which city or which place are we at a particular moment in time? How do we think holistically what that journey looks from beginning to end with all of the different people and the different players involved along the way? Steve?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this one because this is really, and this is core business. Yeah, I mean, we are here to help people share information. So let me tell you what we've learned, and it's very interesting. I've been coming to conferences like this for about 10 years. And I get very frustrated with the level of the debate, which is we must share more information. This means absolutely nothing, honestly. It's an empty phrase. The challenge is not sharing more information, it's actually sharing less information. You don't want to share lots of information. It doesn't know anyone any good. You won't know what to do with it. So I would put it like this. The biggest lesson I have learned in my position over the last 10 years is the trick is to share the right information at the right time with the right person, and here comes the sting in the tail, for a particular purpose. And this is what I don't see happening, unfortunately. I see lots of people sharing lots of information of different value, right down from indicators of compromise, of which there are millions of the things, right up to strategic information. I think what really needs to happen, if you're going to get benefit out of information exchange, is to be very clear about the kind of information you want, when you want it, and what you want it for. And then you have a reasonable chance of setting up a framework which really works. Now, that's also subject to the provisos, which I've said. It may not be that this information gives you want even under these conditions, but that's probably the best you can do. Let me give you the second half and then pass over to the colleagues, and more specialized than I am. I think the other thing I learned about cooperating over the last years is how difficult it is to do. So, yes, cooperate, but I would say out of every 10 cooperation agreements we're going to ENISA, maybe one survives. And it tends to survive because people are too ambitious, the aims are too too fuzzy, and we don't use this principle, which ENISA certainly uses these days, which is use baby steps with concrete deliverables and buy confidence as you move along. And I think if we do these two things together, we're very good. And my very final comment is I really loved someone's comment, one of my colleagues here, about sharing resources. In a world in which these resources are very scarce, to the extent it does not affect competition, we have to get into the business of sharing resources. And NISA is doing this all the while. I go over to Europol, they come over to our place, we go to EDA, we're all the while talking to the Commission. It has got to be like that. So a model for sharing expertise will be of fantastic value for the industry, I think.
Excellent. Paul?
Yes, thank you very much. So I wanted to start by saying we need to share more information, but now I'm afraid to. But
I'm sure in context it makes sense.
But generally, obviously, to a certain extent, and this is pretty banal to say it, but the wording and the element of knowing what you cover is an aspect of any insurance, and it is not particular to cyber insurance. The only thing that is particular to cyber insurance is that the reality has not been really grasped by conventions, precedences, and decisions that are enforceable by law. So to a certain extent, we are currently at the race where certain players and technological development creates reality, and we just need to work out the right framework and the right terms for this reality. No one of us can do it on their own. It makes absolutely sense to standardize and to share as much as we can within the industry, because to a certain extent cyber resilience is what we all want to build, and it's not about selling products, it's just making sure that first and foremost we stay we can go on with our usual business rather than thinking about how to protect ourselves. And therefore, from an insurance company perspective, I mean, we are absolutely open to share the resources that we see, because again, we will not by our own be able to work out a standard product that is meaningful for all our clients, being a multinational company. And this standardization is absolutely needed, just the point that was raised before, like, as we said, a company like Airbus will never buy from the shelf product. But if you are the owner of an SME, a small, medium company, you absolutely need to somebody do the work for you. And the more we can go for the definition of what is actually a cyber risk, what is actually a cyber war, and what is the role of the insurers, what is the role of the governments. This is something that, today is still open up for negotiations to a certain extent, and I think that if we have more clearance on this from also from a general point of view, it will be extremely necessary and helpful for the entire industry. And then again, I think that on the point of let's not share in a silly way, let's make it meaningful and let's make it matter. I absolutely believe in the fact that some resources can be organized more locally, for example, within the European Union. Smaller countries that face similar challenges, I think here we will see more cooperation, and I hope we will be part of this.
Philip?
Yeah, once I had a presentation from an expert on cybersecurity, and he had a very nice slide that he called the wall of shame, where he put all the companies that were victim of a cyber attack. And that was really poor for me, because it makes no sense. There is no shame of being attacked. In fact, what really matters is how you are resilient to an attack. And so therefore, we really need to secure that from a communication standpoint, companies are now aware that in fact what matters is to be able to communicate on the fact that they are now resilient to an attack, and it's okay to be attacked. It's something that can happen to any organization. But the point is to be prepared and to show resilience. And I am definitely convinced that as digitalization is part of the strategy of the growth of each and every company, there will be some questions marks from external bodies who are there to evaluate the quality of the company, the financial support of the company, about what is their capacity of cyber resilience, and potentially to give a financial value to the company depending on that. And insurance is part of the body of these cyber resilience tools. So therefore, really, that's one aspect where, I mean, being able to have this clarification about the challenge is not to be attacked. The challenge is to be able to resist to that, to be resilient to that. Second element is about cooperation. Yes, we are definitely convinced that cooperation is efficient, also economically. And maybe by sector, we see that there is probably some specificity by sector. We see that on the banks, we see that maybe on the pharmaceutical side, on the aviation side, and that gathering people around the table that develop a common understanding of what are the standards that we expect on that sector. For example, on the supply chain issue. And we have one example, which is a company called a joint venture called Boost Aerospace, which is a joint venture between Thales, Airbus, Safran, and Dassault, where together we defined a program called Air Cyber, which for all the suppliers, we will kind of define the steps about cybersecurity for each of those suppliers, because in fact, those suppliers are sometimes the common suppliers for all the different bodies. So it makes sense to have a common view of what we expect as a standard. So this sort of cooperation really, and adapt this cooperation to the specificity of the sector, and having in mind that it has to be economically efficient, because that's really the driver, then that becomes really the result.
May I just add to that? And Philippe made me think of one point that I think it's also interesting to point out, is that cyber resilience in itself can also be a product that you sell. It's also a selling point to your customers, and I think that, you know, the better we can measure it, the better we can express it, it really becomes also a driver of investment, because once you know, there are more and more companies who actually sell the fact that they're cyber resilient as a way to approach customers, and I believe that, you know, we heard one of the examples just before the panel, then obviously, you know, investors will also understand that this is actually key edge of this company, and companies who promote themselves as being cyber resilient, as being stable, as being, you know, trusted to others, will trade as a premium. And then, you know, CEOs will also find it easier to dedicate the right resources to building cyber resilience. So we think we have every interest in really working up a framework of how to express cyber resilience in a methodological manner, because then it will really be a driver of the right investments and the appreciation of that.
If I could, sorry, I seem to have lost my thing. Can you hear me? It turns out to be very difficult to do this. Let me give you an example of why that is. If you work in a bank, like I did for many years, integrity is king, because if your data is not integral, you lose a lot of money. If you work for an electricity company, it's all about availability. If the grid goes down, nobody gets any electricity. Now that seems obvious when I tell it like that, but when you get security experts talking to each other, this doesn't always come out straight away. The point is that security is very context dependent. So I do agree it would be very nice to have a standard definition of cyber resilience, but it will have to vary with the context in which you are operating. You know, risks mean very different things to very different people. So let's agree to try and do that. And ENISA has been trying to do this for 10 years. We do a lot of work on this. Please go to our website and have a look. We've defined it for many contexts. But it turns out to be something that you will not, in my opinion, get one definition of cyber resilience. You will get definition for specific contents and specific risk levels, and that's just fine.
It needs to be sector approach, but investors get that. You know,
Yeah,
like if you're an investor and you're covering energy companies or telcos, you will understand just the important part is which ones do you, whom do you give the premium?
I only say it because it's not obvious.
And to be resilient, you'd rather buy the right insurance coverage. If you just buy a cyber insurance coverage which is useless for such an event, then you are not better off.
I'll close the panel in a moment and open the floor for the audience, but I think the key thing that I guess derives from all of our speakers today is, yes, we need to keep dialogue open, we need to keep engaged and collaborating together. We need to start to think about how to do that in the most efficient and effective ways. But we also need to think, well, can we leverage off each other as well? On that note, we've got about 5 minutes left for questions. Is there anyone in the audience that would have any questions? Yes, at the back.
Sorry, I had to get off my throne here. So, my name is Manu Mohan. I'm from Ernst & Young. A recent report published by the EIOPA noted that more than 90% of cyber insurance is actually based in the US, and only about 5 to 9% is Europe-centric. And there was another survey done by EY which noted that in regard to global information security, which noticed that more than 65% of the companies are not confident that they have enough cyber insurance coverage. Now, in the context of those statements and comments by Lloyd's, etc., that cyber insurance can be as much as like a loss in a hurricane, why is there a perceived lack of demand in Europe for cyber insurance, which is leading to this shortfall in supply in Europe? And if there is this lack of demand, how can companies in Europe be encouraged to go for more cyber insurance? And on the supply side, why is there? Why are European companies or insurers facing a difficulty? Is it lack of data, or is it like a chicken and egg problem? There is no demand, so there is no supply. Thank you.
Paul, as a European insurer?
Yes, I mean, there clearly is an insurance gap for cyber in Europe, and obviously the US is leading the way, partially because, this is the economy that, with the most resources, with the biggest IP, and which is the most challenged to a certain extent, and so companies have that understanding, partially because, American insurers were able to work out standards that to a certain extent appeal to corporates, and the European market is simply more fragmented. And while I always have a ambivalent approach to brokers, I think that brokers here did a good job in also, standardizing the approach and fostering and popularizing cyber insurance in the US. So I think the problem about the European market is that it's quite fragmented, and we lack the one product that everybody can buy. And for the same reason that we just said, I think what we need to do right now is to push for a bigger standardization, better framework, and then obviously promote it stronger within the European Union. And I think that obviously the EU should be moving much faster than it is right now.
I would like to...
The EU is a market, not as an institution.
Yeah, but I would like to add a caveat emptor to that. Look, there are three ways of handling risk. One is simply to accept it, one is to mitigate it, and one is to insure it. Every method has its place. What I would not want to see is an over-reliance on insurance. I mean, in Europe, the key way of dealing with risk is to mitigate it, because this, of course, brings better security. So much as we support, of course, the idea of a cybersecurity insurance market, I think it's tremendously important. I would not like to see companies thinking, we can get away with less security by insuring ourselves. I think there is a risk there to some extent, and it has to be that the primary mechanism for dealing with this in Europe is strong mitigation, and the cyber insurance covers what cannot be mitigated successfully, which I think is probably the typical way of doing insurance anyway. I think it's necessary to say that because it's not evident.
There's a fourth way also with dealing risk, which is to ignore it. And unfortunately,
That's accepting it in a sense, yeah. That's accepting it. But okay.
That's unfortunately not the way. Yeah, and that's also something that we should be fighting.
I think the other thing to keep in mind in general in terms of cyber insurance and the growth in the European market is that the US is a more developed, more mature market in terms of cyber. So you give Europe a period of time and then it's likely as well that both supply and demand will increase. Similarly in new regions as well. So the Asian Pacific region, the Australasian region are also now looking towards more cyber insurance to areas which traditionally maybe haven't had the understanding, haven't had products available, haven't even seen the need for it, and now starting to realize, yes, we need to, I guess, put a framework around how we manage that cyber risk, and insurance is part of it, or should be part of it, or could be part of it. So we have,
Minus 12 seconds.
yes, we have 14 seconds left. Is there anyone else that has a really quick question? No. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
During our cybersec journey this day, we will now ask the basic question: who will defend our cyberspace? What is the role of the European Union with its defense fund and PESCO? And is Europe capable of achieving autonomy in that respect? All of that and other topics will be discussed during the panel discussion, European Defense Industry. What future for EU cyber defense? Let me introduce to the stage Ms. Marta Kepe, Analyst for Defense, Security and Infrastructure at RAND Europe, and Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council, who will moderate this debate.
Our panel indeed will be focused on European defense and defense industry, but not only that, because the EU exists within the constellation of many other actors. So over the last several years, we've seen an increased number and intensity of cyber-based attacks on government, but also public, private, and other actors. Earlier today, we heard some of the speakers say that cyber defense is a team sport, and we are only as strong in Europe as is our weakest link, which means really that EU exists within the constellation or a group of other actors, international actors such as NATO, but also private actors, industry as well, that really holds the skills and the capabilities that we need for defense. And also academia and public actors as well. So over the last years, we've also seen that cyber defense and security has become a really a strong topic on the EU agenda. But not only both on strategic level, so starting from the EU global strategy, but also all the way over to PESCO projects. With that, in the session, we're going to talk about the EU's role and the role of EU as a leader within cybersecurity and defense, but also what does it mean to cooperate with defense industry, NATO and other actors. How can we make the most of this cooperation? Where are the vulnerability factors as well? With that, and not to be a very lengthy barrier between you and lunch, because this is the last session before lunch. Let me introduce our speakers today. So first we have Mr. Tomasz Zyskot, who is the Secretary of Defense at the Polish Ministry of National Defense. Previously, he was also the Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Interior and Administration. In both positions, he's worked a lot on cybersecurity, and previously the Ministry of Interior. He also worked on combating cybercrime. We also have Wolfgang Rohring. He is the head of unit of information superiority at the EDA. He's been a key driving force between EDA's work on cybersecurity and defense, having shaped the cyber defense program there. And he's also served at the German Armed Forces Cyber and Information Domain Services headquarters, and he previously held officer level positions at the German Navy and Joint Services. Colonel Yaktarian is the current director of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And previously he was the commander of the Estonian Air Forces. And last but not least, we have a defense industry representative, Merle Maigre. Hello. Merle is the executive vice president at the Government Relations at Cyber Exer Technologies, an Estonian cyber security company. Until last year, she was the director of NATO Cyber Center of Excellence, and previously she's held the position of National Security Advisor of the current and previous Estonian president. So welcome to the panel. Without further ado, I will let you shortly speak about the topics that we're covering today, and I will start with Wolfgang as the EU representative here.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and I think this is a good opportunity to bring closer to you the European activities on cyber defense, and to the understanding that this is clearly a priority area for capability development and research. But before I want to dive deep on cyber, let's start with some general figures about defense, because I think this is quite relevant. So the defense expenditures of EU member states in 2016 were about 2.8 billion euros, which brings it down to roughly 1.4% of the GDP of European member states. So just taking the hypothetical scenario, because we all know the discussions, this will be raised to 2% of the GDP. We are talking about, for example, for this year, about raising it to 322 billion euros for defense on an annual basis. Well, I compare this now with the figures spent for collaborative developments and purchases. So out of these 208 billions I mentioned for the last year, in 2016, 6.3 billions were spent in a collaborative manner for capability purchase and development, and just 143 million euros for research and development. So when you compare the figures, these are clearly breadcrumbs, and therefore I think we have to take into account to bring this in a more coherent way to have better value for money. We have to be better organized at a European level, and there is more debate needed just to talk about to raise it up to 2%, but it's more the question of how do we spend the available budget better. What definitely should be avoided is that we create a disconnect which would create a reduced interoperability of our forces. That's one of the important things. And we have to invest in innovation and innovative technologies like artificial intelligence and nanotechnologies, because we have to expect that these technologies will change the battlefield of future military operations. And here also Europe cannot stay behind. So the underlying idea I want clearly to convey is that what we spend, that we spend this better. And before, again, coming to cyber specifically, let's introduce a bit on the current developments in Europe. We clearly have at the moment a sense of change with respect to European defense. While working on the implementation of the EU global strategy, we are confronted with terms like PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, like CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, the European Defence Fund, the EDIDP, and so on. So, what I already said before, we have to ensure that these building blocks, you can call them building blocks or also fragments, that we are employing these building blocks with the ultimate goal to turn this into something much more coherent than we experience today. Taking the example of the European Defence Fund, the Defence Fund is expected from our perspective to act as a catalyst for a stronger European defence industry that develops state-of-the-art technology and fully interoperable technology and equipment. So we expect this as a certain turning point, also in view of a strategic autonomy of and competitiveness of European industry. And this for sure also includes the many small and medium enterprises and startups, which make in fact the breeding ground for innovative cyber solutions. I want to stress again the point, we have to achieve a better money for value in order to defend our citizens. So, coherence on the approach from priorities to impact in military operations. So for that end, we need the integration of priorities for the development of European capabilities. One of the instruments we have is the so-called Capability Development Plan, which was just recently in summer last year approved by the EDA Steering Board at the level of ministers, and this is a 4-year iterative process. And amongst the 11 priorities identified in this plan, for sure, cyber has its place with the headline, Enabling Capabilities for Cyber Responsive Operations. So the task is now to link these priorities with the different initiatives I mentioned in the beginning. So with PESCO, with CARD, with the EDIDP, with the European Defence Fund on a day-to-day basis for generating collaboratively developed capability projects in a way that the results contribute to a greater coherence. EDA for the implementation of this capability, EDA since 2012 runs its own cyber defense program, and based on the last revision of this capability development plans, there are 5 centers of gravity. On the one hand side, the improved cyber defense skills of military personnel, the development of state-of-the-art cyber defense technologies, and following here a strongly system engineering and architectural approach. To improve coordination with other European agencies, Steve mentioned already the cooperation between EDA and the other 3 agencies, the approach to system engineering I mentioned, and the area of cyber defense research. And I think one of the things we clearly have to take into account to bring cyber defense measures in the other domains, air, maritime, land, and where appropriate also space. In order to conclude, and to keep roughly in the 5 minutes given to me, I clearly want to stress the points before I hand over to my co-panelists and then into the panel discussion. The strategic landscape of European defense embodied in the CDP, CARD, PESCO, EDF, and so on, must be coherent and coordinated in support of improving military capabilities of EU member states. Not EU capabilities, member states capabilities, also important to understand. We have set our priorities in accordance with the 5 topics I mentioned before. Here, especially in the field of research, the effort should be focused on forward-looking and innovative technologies, and for that EDA is in the process of agreeing and maintaining a cyber strategic research agenda. And the last point, improve cooperation. I mentioned already the cooperation we have with the other 3 agencies in the area, with the European Cybercrime Center, ENISA, and CERT-EU. Here also to mention for sure is the NATO-EU joint declaration and the already long-lasting cooperation we have since 2013 with the Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And that should conclude my input. I hope I was close to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Jaak, so we have the NATO-EU cooperation going on. We also have NATO's Cyber Defense Pledge. What is the take on from the other important international organization in this sector?
Right. You're bouncing the opposites off. You knew I was going to be slightly Eurosceptical, so clever plan. It's great to be in a panel right before lunch because everyone is awake, but nobody's listening. It's the best time to be a speaker. So, I'm a great fan of EU for its successful track record in policy. I get very skeptical when I hear about the new EU defense industry, or not defense industry, but defense initiative, because of the track record. It hasn't been stellar. Quite often, the EU defense initiatives in the past have been used one of the three reasons: either the excuse to spend less, kind of we'll pool and share and we'll be more efficient so we can spend less, for protecting industry, European industry, and from protectionism you get less capable product later in the schedule and at a higher cost. Or sometimes it's been because of counter-Americanism. If European leaders don't get along with the leader or administration in Washington, then we get new defense initiatives. Last time was 2003 or so. I think example was Galileo was born. I had to Google Galileo to find out what's happened. So I found out that actually it's semi-operational now, 16 years later. And I don't know how many billions later, and almost successfully duplicating what GPS has been already doing. Sorry for being so skeptical. I don't know if some industry felt offended by that, but didn't mean to. It's just one example that popped into my mind. In the cyberspace, we can't afford to be counter transatlantic relations. We are in the same cyber domain. Europe doesn't have the same firepower alone that we would have with our like-minded allies across the globe, not just across Atlantic, but also to the other side. There are great nations like Australia and Japan joining our CCD COE. We're excited about that cooperation, and I hope this kind of a transatlantic and international cooperation will continue also throughout the European projects. That's the only way for them to be successful. And I'm very happy that the aircraft here on the picture looks a lot like American-built F-18, so we're not talking about complete protectionism, so that's good to see. So what is a successful way? Spending more, as you brought out. I don't know, different nations do it at a different pace, but with no particular nation in mind, raising your defense spending by 3% annually, or 3% increments, that's called keeping up with inflation. That doesn't make up the capability gap that was left from underspending throughout the 2 decades of peace dividends. So it needs to be significantly more spending. Coordination, cooperation, no duplication. Those are the key words. We can't afford to duplicate capabilities that are already existing somewhere else amongst the friends or allies. Especially in cyber, as in addition to wasting resources, money, we're also wasting human resources. There is a very tight pool of cyber experts that can work either in government or industry. So if we start duplicating functions and establishing operation centers where we need those expert people, we're competing not only against industry, but amongst different government institutions. That's unnecessary. There's a good example of competing for good human capital is on this panel. The previous director of CCD COE works for private industry now, and about 3 good tech experts from our center work there as well. So it's competition is live and ongoing. There is a lack of human capital. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Tomasz, Poland is a member of both EU and NATO. It's also the home of an established defense industry. What is your take on this?
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. as a representative of Polish government, I couldn't start differently than with saying congratulations to the organizers, which is Polish think tank. Good job. Next CyberSec is a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about cooperation, which is a crucial thing, and we are talking about this about it almost on every edition of CyberSec. But here in Brussels, of course, European Union is our main point of reference. So the questions asked was, can and will Europe play a big role in global cybersecurity environment? And well, I guess that European Union itself and European countries have everything what is needed, what is necessary to play a big, one of the main, or maybe the main roles in global cyber security environment, starting from, of course, users and societies, very familiar and open to new technologies. Then a lot of centers of excellence, a lot of science R&D units, and then industry that can change ideas into the real solutions. A lot of operational entities, and I guess that there is a big framework for a comprehensive approach, because there is a wide range of threats, especially in the eastern flank of NATO, which is also an eastern flank of European Union. There is a very high level of understanding of threats coming from all of the operational domains excluded by the NATO. For example, look at the location of and the specific of centers of excellence that NATO established, starting from Estonia, CCDCOE, then Latvia, Riga, Stratcom, strategic communication. Then we have Lithuania, which is a leading country in one of the very interesting PESCO projects, Cyber Rapid Response Teams, which are a member of from November 2018 as Poland. Then Poland, of course, as I mentioned, Polish think tank is one of the main organizer of this event, but also we have in Krakow a military counterintelligence center of excellence. So there's a high level of understanding of threats coming from different domains, like cyber domain, of course. And speaking about comprehensive approach, I won't say only about what I believe in or what I think of that issue, but also a few words about what we are really doing in Poland. On February 5th this year, we have launched a program called cyber.mil.pl, which is dedicated to develop all the pillars of cybersecurity, because it is not a question of developing military aspects, civilian aspects, R&D projects, intelligence services, military units, universities, academia in general. They're all very important, and comprehensive approach is a way of developing every one of them. Of course, I can say that I believe that some of them are, shall go first. For example, building stable structures, or education and training, which is crucial for, especially for our public sector, because it is easier to create experts than to buy them from market, which is slightly impossible. But what we have established, what we have launched in Poland, is dedicated to boost almost every pillar of the system. So since 2015, we have tripled the number of cadets in our military universities in studies connected with cyberspace generally, so cybersecurity, cryptology, IT, and so on. And then, well, we have decided to create cyberspace defense forces as a military component of our armed forces. It is a process ongoing now. There is an offer for the ones who wants to still play a part in civilian market as experts in civilian companies, for example, but also be a part of military. So we are building a cyber component in territorial defense forces, like in National Guard in United States. And we are joining and uniting units to create cyber security national cyber security center. We are developing R&D projects. We have a strong belief in R&D. We are cooperating with, of course, with European agencies. We have a strong belief in PESCO projects. Some of them are really very interesting because they are not only focusing on exchanging information and so on, but also about really dealing with operational and cases, like the project led by Lithuania, this Cyber Rapid Response Teams project, which is an operational one, which is not only about creating an environment, but working together in case of a real incidents. So coming back, I have a minute. Coming back to a little bit to EU funding, because especially you have started from the question, and I guess that what is very important, that's why I mentioned about COEs located in the eastern flank. I guess that so-called geographic balance is important, because it is real crucial, very important that industries, companies from all over Europe and European Union have the same access to the resources and funding, EU funding, and besides geographic balance, so-called, we may call it maybe scale balance. Not only the biggest companies, not only the largest ones, but also small and medium enterprises, startups, and mid-caps companies. I guess there is a great potential, innovative potential, in those companies which are not the greatest ones and not only coming from the Western countries.
Thank you. Merle, you as a defense industry representative on the panel, so defense industry is really an important actor because it holds a lot of knowledge and skills that we really need. And small and medium enterprises are often heralded for their ability to innovate faster and have really bring that added value to European defense and security. How do you see this question?
Well, thank you, and also thank you for having a voice from the industry in the panel. Great to be here. Well, I believe that whereas the primary responsibility for national security, including in cyberspace, lies within the member states, including the governments and the private sector, then EU definitely can and does add value to all of this. And you, Wolfgang, started it off, but a few sort of key phrases that resonate for me as coming from the private sector. Well, more in generally, over the past 5 years, I believe the EU regulations and directives have had a really serious impact on cybersecurity of member states, including both at government level and the private sector. Few concrete examples include the NIS directive, which stimulates a strategic and operational cooperation among EU member state stakeholders. The new certification framework, which is highly relevant in the current standoff with China in the 5G and Huawei discussion, and naturally the proposals for a significant new funding for cybersecurity in the EU's next budget, the EU's Cybersecurity Competence Center. There, I believe the devil really is in the detail, and I'll be intrigued to look how the implementation of the Digital Europe program, along with the new financing, is really happening after the EU elections. But above all, I'd like to focus here in my short intervention, the 5 minutes, I'd like to focus on the strategic approach, because for the private sector, as well as for the governments, it all really starts from the strategic understanding of cyber threats. And here, I believe it's the key is for the private sector, for the supervisory board, as well as the executive directors who need to understand and approach cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide management issue, not just as an IT issue. It's something that was echoed in previous panels, but I cannot agree more, because it all starts about understanding where you need to direct the investments.
The thinking so far has often gone wrong, and I believe the small and medium companies are a little bit bigger culprits here often than the bigger enterprises. The thinking goes wrong when the technology is regarded as a support function rather than the core business agent and instrument. And this approach to cybersecurity as a support function leaves cybersecurity to the techies, to someone else, to the IT department. And well, it stems from the historic corporate, siloed corporate structures and approach. The slippery slope of this is that when the critical cybersecurity responsibility is handed off to the IT, this is the department that in most organizations is strapped for resources and has cut budget. So we're not really investing enough into cyber. So cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide risk management issue needs to be addressed. Needs to be addressed both from the strategic, from the operational, cross-departmental, and economic perspective. And it all starts from asking the right questions, knowing to ask the right questions. And here I'd like to compliment the European Defence Agency along with the EU, who were the ones who really believed into the importance of asking the right questions. And that was when the EDA supported the Estonian initiative back in September 2017, when during the Estonian EU Council presidency, for the first time ever in Tallinn, EU defense ministers gathered for an informal meeting and sat down for an hour and a half out of their busy schedules for a tabletop cybersecurity exercise, Cyber 2017. First time ever. So what did the defense ministers actually, what were some of the key questions that they asked? The key analytical questions fell into 4 categories, basically. Time is about how much time do we have during a cyber crisis, and how far can plans be made ahead? How much time ahead can plans be made? Secondly, transparency, which deals with the question of public exposure to your decisions. Thirdly, authority, which is about how much high or low do you delegate the authority during the cyber crisis solutions or finding out solutions to a cyber incident. And finally, cooperation, which is about both cooperation with the industry, cooperation within intergovernmental agencies, but also cooperation with EU or between EU and NATO, because back at the exercise in Estonia, there were EU defense ministers along with Mogherini, but also the NATO section, Stoltenberg participated. So it was a really useful way to simulate how the two organizations work together. So I believe that this exercise or this lesson learned is relevant not just for the defense ministers, but cyber exercises should go beyond the military community boundaries and include other ministers. Why not ministers of foreign affairs, finance? Everybody has a stake, and not just the ministries, but also the private sector enterprises, the board members. Some of the sort of lessons learned and check questions could include how often is cybersecurity discussed at board meetings or for the government meetings in that regard? What are from the company's perspective, what are the company's most critical data assets? How do the IT systems interact with these data assets? Are we spending wisely on cybersecurity? And finally, do we know if the spending on IT is cost effective? And here, and am I close to summing up to understanding whether the spending is cost effective. Again, exercises are a good way for stock taking, and especially in the military realm. Exercises are times when militaries get certified, qualified, so on. So I remember from back the days when I worked with the Estonian president, we visited a NATO steadfast juncture exercise in Estonia, that was back in 2012, but it was a computer exercise where the overall goal was to develop a command and control interoperability for NATO forces. So there were about 400 NATO officers and NCOs in different bunkers in Estonia. Everybody had a computer in front of them, and we tried to understand what was going on. And we really didn't understand, because there was no visualization. It was very, very difficult to really get at the top level for the president, for the ministers, for the management, for the top leadership. It's difficult to understand cyber, and in order to mitigate that, one of the crucial aspects is to provide clear visualization. So, as a way of summing up, I believe first, when speaking of the future, but this is really short-term future, I think at first is we need to focus at the demystification or demystifying cyber for the top leadership, because this is where they are the ones who adopt decisions. And demystification can take place through tabletop exercises as well as visualization of cyber exercises. My second point would be the importance of cyber hygiene as the foundation really of cybersecurity, cyber hygiene from the whole of society approach and from the whole of government approach. And thirdly and finally, the importance of cyber threat intelligence sharing. And I hear the criticism of the ENISA representative earlier that you need to be specific about what you share and whom you share. When looking ahead for this year, for 2019, and speaking about cyber threat intelligence sharing, for me this is what is crucial, is that we look very carefully at what goes on in Ukraine, where within about a month's time we have the presidential elections and then parliamentary elections further down the line, and exchange the threat analysis and look very carefully at what happens in Kiev. Why should we care about the election security in Ukraine and Kiev? Because what happens in Kiev will very soon hit us in Brussels, in Rome, in Amsterdam, and in DC maybe. And I'll conclude here, and let's discuss some of the things in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of interesting perspectives, and also questions are coming up. One of that is drawing on the last point of information sharing. Looking at the EU's level of ambition, do you think that we have set it on the right level? Is there scope for being even more ambitious? And especially when it comes to cooperation with other partners. So we had cooperation with NATO, other international organizations, but also Jaak mentioned non-EU nation states, such as US, Australia, or other partners. And even more so cooperation with our own European defense industry and industrial partners. Are we ambitious enough right now? Or if not, what else can we do to really make the most of these partnerships, at the same time avoiding the potential vulnerabilities that could come about through cooperation? I'll start with you, because you brought up the issue.
I brought up the issue. Well, I think there are some basic rules and regulations quite usefully set up by EU. I refer to the GDPR requirements to inform about breaches that involve our personal data. There are rules regarding sharing and breaches regarding included in the NIS directive. At the closer to the grassroots level, I believe it boils down to the trust that is built within nations, if we speak of member states. And if I think of Estonia's example, it is the Estonian State Information Authority, which is an agency responsible for the security and the integrity of the Estonian X-Road and online services, and they are the ones driving to build the community of cybersecurity actors and stakeholders, keeping together the interagency cooperation from the government side, but also including the private sector key players, and keeping the dialogue ongoing and making sure that information sharing is not overburdened, but that right information is shared at the same time. Yet again, it is clear that in cyber, geographical borders become less and less meaningful, especially when we speak of enterprises. We have big companies that go beyond national borders, and there is the question of the cross-sector cross-private sector threat intelligence sharing amongst each other, and whether how much that is regulated and whether there is room for more. I perhaps pass the microphone on that for people who are wiser here in Brussels and also residing here in Brussels, who know better of like what's cooking.
First of all, I doubt whether I'm wiser than you, but I want to dwell on 2 points on the question. You mentioned the term trust, and one of the things I was always emphasizing is when we talk about trust, we should not talk in general about trust. Trust has a wide span from total untrust to full trust, which I expect or which I think is not existing between individuals. So this is the span, and I have people or entities I trust more, and I have people and entities I trust less. And that trust level should, to a certain extent, give an indicator how much I'm willing to share or how much the entities are willing to share. And I agree with Steve, who mentioned in the beginning, sharing should have a purpose, because otherwise I drown in information, because I have the problem to select which is now relevant for me and which not. Therefore, that's one of the aspects, and where I clearly think we can do more at this stage at European level. I don't want to talk about exchange between member states on the civil side. I don't want to talk about exchange, sharing of information for collective defense. That is much more on the side of NATO. But I want to talk about information sharing for military operation, which are EU-led, and there we have clearly room for improvement. Although we have now a cyber cell as element of INCENT within the hybrid fusion cell, we don't have made general provisions yet that we have the same information sharing level when it comes to cyber for specific operations. I think here we should start to set a common standard and to develop a common concept for information sharing and to do the prerequisites. Operations are usually ad hoc, EU-led military operations, but the more we are able to reach back to already agreed standard operating procedures, and we know what we want to exchange and with whom, the faster we get the operation running. And with that, I want to hand over to the rest of the panel.
During almost every conference of that type, we are talking a lot about cooperation and information sharing. And of course, it's crucial. It's very important, and it is obvious in a way, because in a national dimension, in a multinational dimension, the threats are coming from different directions. Almost any country, I guess, is capable of dealing with them alone. But it is not easy. Of course, we have to say it, and I guess that we are all aware that information sharing in this domain, especially in military domain, in the intelligence domain, it is not easy, and although it is crucial, it is very important. And sometimes it has to be enforced, of course, by law, by the legal framework, especially due to critical infrastructure and some of the most important entities. But it is not easy. It is a case, it is a task for the NATO, it is a task for European Union to create a framework to integrate, to create interoperability, to create systems that will allow us to exchange the information in a safe way. And so it is a task for everyone, because we have, I guess that we are all aware that it is very important, it is crucial, it is obvious, it is not easy, it is still not easy in national dimension. So where are we in multinational, in international level? It is not only a question of European countries, of European Union itself. For example, in the United States cyber security strategy, there is not ongoing but upcoming, I guess, initiative, cyber deterrence initiative, which I guess it is an idea to strengthen cooperation with the allies, with the partners, which will enforce information sharing and wider range of common initiatives like exercises and so on. So I guess not only Europe, not only our partners in this region are thinking about how to create a common environment, but also United States is also, of course, mentioned here Australia and so on. It is a matter of creating the safe, proper environment and to build a trust. It is not something that can be given at a moment. It is a process that can be instructed in a second and is being built for years. So.
Well, I have pieces left. Three smart people have spoken on a topic. There are a lot of C's in the organization, in the name of the organization where I now work, CCD COE. The first C stands for cooperation or cooperative, and I didn't get it half a year ago when I got to the job. It took me less than a week to get how important that cooperation is. So absolutely crucial. Steve said very eloquently in the last panel that the answer is not sharing more, it is sharing the right stuff. The real world example would be everybody's had the colleague in the office that CCs everything to everybody, and in the end you don't read, you just delete those emails. So that's the bad kind of, that's sharing more without regard of whether it's necessary or not. So I fully subscribe to last panel's suggestion that sharing, I don't remember it, but is it the right stuff to the right people at the right time? And there was one more thing that I need to find the person who said it and then learn it. So. Okay.
Thank you. So another important aspect of cyber defense is really that it's not only about the product, it's not only about the hardware and software, it is also about the person, so the human capital and the skills and knowledge we have. During this panel, also previously, and a lot of my own organization around Europe's work has focused on the criticality of cyber-related skills, not only the government, but also in the private domains, and really the shortages of people who have the right skills for the right purpose. I know that you are all aware of this problem, and I was just wondering, what is your opinion about what can we do on an EU or national level in order to improve the situation, to ensure that Europe is able to, Europe actually has the capability and the human capital in order to ensure cyber defense capability and is not sort of vulnerable to these shortages.
We're a training organization also. Can I start here?
Sure.
It seems that the problem of scarce human capital follows me, because coming from the Air Force, where all the Air Forces in the world are facing huge pilot shortage, now we're facing in cyber huge tech expertise shortage, and not only tech, it's also legal, cyber, all the other sorts of experts there are. Training and education is the answer. I don't have the answer how to get young people to the military and to military cyber and keep them there. If I did, I'd start my own consulting company and sold that idea. But we do offer a lot of training courses to the military people who are already in their militaries, and that nations deem to send to our courses, not because of who are not in the military. And while my first statement was somewhat gloomy, then yes, we have great cooperation with EDA, and you have participated in Lock Shields, which is the largest live fire cyber defense exercise in the world, and everybody who's participated there, all the teams, more than 1,000 people, 22 teams last year, were very, very grateful for the realistic training that they received. But we can't do it all on our own. We always have line out of the door for our training courses. So there needs to be more education and training in cyber, so that the market's wide open for the private sector, government sector to establish better training programs.
Any more short answers, because we only have a couple of minutes?
Maybe from me, one or 2 points. Jaak mentioned in the end, there's a market. Yes, and that's one of the important things to understand. Cyber defense or cyber security education and training is a market with an enormous volume. And that's, I think, we have to understand on the industrial side, but also on the side of, I would say, the consumers or those who need the human capital or the humans who are dealing with that. That I have to come to a balanced system where I use industry training to a great extent, for sure, at the level primarily for the cyber defense or cybersecurity specialists, so the true specialists. But I also have to augment this with awareness program for my entire set of employees, and what mentioned by Merle, that I train my decision makers correctly to take the right decision and to have the right understanding about what cyber means for them, for their operations, being there an industry company, but also or a military commander. That he is not interested in the technical aspects. He is interested in the mission impact cyber events can have, and there we have to train him or her to understand this.
What I'd add into the story is cyber hygiene and basic cyber literacy or basic digital literacy. I believe that's something that should be introduced already at early age in schools, age 6, age 7, and why not have some EU best practices in that regard. Also important, I believe, as Jaak mentioned, that we don't just need IT geeks, but we need cyber experts who have philosophy background, sociology background, legal background, and so on and so on. So it's not just the STEMs that should be encouraged to study, but I think cyber should be a layer in every educational program, be it humanitarian or the economics or IT.
Thomas, any answer?
One of the most important things in cyber domain in general, I guess, that creating, building, developing human potential, human capital is one of the most important tasks for public sector, and it is a great stream for public-private cooperation, because we as a public sector need experts, need to train them, and in different ways, in different manners, because not all of them have to accomplish 5-year studies, which is the effect is delayed. Sometimes we should use the American way of thinking, as I understand it, because we don't always need to look for a genius youngster. Sometimes we need just a clever one that will get a proper training, provided sometimes, but by the private sector, which is, as I mentioned, a great stream for PPP, for public-private cooperation. And we have to be open. One example, last year on November in Poland, we have organized, some say the biggest, some say the second largest hackathons in the world. And first time in history, Polish armed forces were partnering, were a part of this hackathon. We have organized cybersecurity component in this event, and it was that successful that just after this hackathon, just after this event, we get about, I don't know, maybe 100 curriculums, people interested in service in different units of Polish Ministry of National Defense area.
Thank you. And here, very quickly, and I think we can hear the hunger in the audience already as we're preparing for the lunch break. So very quickly, just in a couple of words, last question from me is, how do you see what could be the multinational cooperation frameworks, areas, or ways and means how we could contribute to European defense and enhance it? I'll start with Jaak.
I don't have specific projects to name right now, but key is to avoid duplication and to do it for the right motives, not to do it in spite of some temporal disagreements that are in transatlantic relations, but to do it to make Europe and the Western Democratic Alliance stronger.
Thomas?
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of need-driven approach. So there has to be a need and an answer and an answer given by the proper project. So first of all, the military sector, the civilian sector in cooperation shall generate the need, and then the answer coming from the EU projects, as I understand sometimes and very often as enhancing the NATO capabilities, like we look on PESCO projects, for example. It is a good idea of building together competences using the tools added and connected with the NATO specific of the operational domain, and with the EU with all the cyber policy ideas and cyber policy tools.
Thank you.
Maybe one point from my side, and that is technology related. To bring technology innovation through the Valley of Death. I want to describe this quite shortly. Technical readiness level describes technologies from 0 to 8. And academia is interested in the baseline research because there's the Nobel Prize to win. Industry is interested in 7 to 8 because that's what they can sell. We have a Valley of Death between 4 to 6. And I think that should be one of the things with venture money, with seed funding, to bring this through our technology development, especially in cyber, through this Valley of Death. And there I see especially the European Defence Fund as a good instrument which could be utilized for this, linking better the excellent academic base we have in Europe with the existing excellent industry. I think there we have to get closer.
Thank you. Marilyn? Yeah, well, for conclusion, rather than throwing out new initiatives, I believe we should implement the ones that we've committed today. And when saying that within NATO framework, I think of the importance of Article 3 and the responsibility of each member state, and the NATO Cyber Defense Pledge, which I believe was very relevantly signed in Warsaw in 2016, that should need to be implemented. And on EU side, also go on with the implementation of Digital Europe program. One last thought. I think when government agencies are focusing primarily, and both on the NATO and EU side, the NIS directive and the NATO cyber pledge for that matter, when government agencies are focusing primarily on defending nations' critical infrastructure, and surely that is very, very important, I believe it is crucial not to forget the importance of private sector cooperation across the industry and include wider parts of the enterprises than just critical infrastructure, because due to the immense amount of data interconnection among the data systems, it is no longer adequate for the enterprises or the organizations to just secure their own network, but they also have to think of their vendors, their partners, their suppliers, and their customers. And it so often is that many organizations are interconnected with elements of the national and cross-national critical infrastructure, while they themselves are something rather insignificant, and raising the prospect of cyber insecurity of one company becoming the vulnerability of the whole system. So that is crucial, and I think a way to test this cross-dependencies through technical cyber exercises, cyber range-based exercises is where the future is.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel. Let's give them a hand. And thank you to the audience persevering up until the lunch break. Thanks.